Hello, in this video we will talk about one of the special Spark Forms Builder controls, which is the SQL Connector control, and how to use it in your SharePoint forms. The SQL Connector control is designed to directly integrate your form with external databases without using SharePoint external connectivity services. The SQL Connector control returns a primary and secondary value based on the selected field's name specified in the database dialog setting. Using rules, you can also consume all the selected field values returned from the search dialog. You can generate your SQL query on form load, or by any control in your form. Also, you can create dynamic queries by sending filters by the form controls. So let's see how to configure and use the SQL Connector control to integrate your form with an external database and retrieve data from it. To add the SQL Connector control, open the form you want to use it in. And from the list at the top, click on Spark Forms Builder to open the canvas to design the form. As you see here, I've previously designed this form to add the SQL Connector in it. If you are interested in how to customize the design for the form in detail, you can watch the tutorial video listed in the description below. Now let's add the SQL Connector control. From the Toolbox panel, under Integration, drag and drop the SQL Connector. Modify the control properties. Enter the control ID. From Control Settings, we are going to connect the SQL Connector control with an external database that we want to retrieve the data from. As we see here, in the Database Dialog setting window, you can specify the database type to connect to, MS SQL, or Oracle. I am going to select MS SQL. Type the connection string of the SQL database that you want to connect with. As we see here, we have two options to create a query. You can create and design your own query manually, or follow the Query Wizard steps to create your query. The Query Wizard here is to simplify the process of creating the SQL query, while designing the free query needs a high level of SQL query and administration knowledge. For now, we are going to select Query Wizard, and then click on Connect. From here, you can select tables, views, or procedures of the provided database to be retrieved. In our case, we are going to select Views, and then select SQL Objects. You can combine your query with dynamic objects, such as form controls, and form variables, and even with static values in the where statement. We will discuss these cases in detail later on. Now let's leave it empty. Select the database field that you want to add its value to your form. From Filter Fields, you can specify the fields that the user can use to search based on, and select the fields to show in the search dialog, or the rendered query controls. You can use the left and right arrow buttons to select or deselect fields, and the up or down arrows to sort and rearrange the fields as well. If this property is left empty, the system will return all list columns in the search dialog. One of the SQL Connector control advanced features is that you can bind and represent the data according to your selection and configuration. You can choose to render the control to be a searchable dialog, drop-down list, checkbox list, or even a radio buttons list control. We will see these cases together. First, we will select the searchable type. We have here a checkbox to display all the data in the search dialog, if the search box is empty or not. We are going to select it and see how it is work. Then click on OK. Now let's map the SQL Connector control with the SharePoint field, to save the control's value in the SharePoint list alongside the other data. Choose whether the control is required or not. OK, after configuring the SQL Connector control, we are going to use the GetSQLData function to retrieve the employee name, and the department, and the job title for the selected employee, by the SQL Connector and set them in the form controls. To add the function, we have to add a rule first. Select the employee number control. Then, from the top ribbon, click on the control rules. Create a new rule. Modify the rule name. Select rule type action, and apply the rule on change. Then add the condition that will apply the function only. if there is an employee number. In the action text box, we are going to add the Generate SQL Data function. From the right panels, under Functions, at the search box type Generate SQL Data. And here it is. You can have more details about the function from here. As we see here, this function needs parameters control ID, retrieved fields, controls to fill. To add the parameters, there are two ways, by the wizard, or manually. I am going to add them manually. Select the SQL Connector ID, here employee number. Type the array that contains the name of SQL fields that you want to retrieve. Here we are going to retrieve the employee name, department, and job title. Then type the array that contains the controls that we want to map with the retrieved fields array. Then click Save. Let's now see how it works. From the top ribbon, click on Preview. We are going to select the employee number by click on the search icon. OK, this is the search dialog pop-up. As you see, here are the search fields that we have selected while we are setting the SQL Connector properties. And these are the display fields that we also selected before. We see also here all the data that exist in the employee's data view, because we have selected the option Show All Data when search box is empty. In our case, the data is small, I can select the employee directly, but in case we have large data, we can search by number, or name, or any search field that we have here. If we uncheck the checkbox that displays all the data, the search dialog will be like this. You can make the search that you want. This SQL Connector control provides an excellent sorting property. The user can sort the results ascending or descending per column, by clicking on any column header in the search dialog. Let's select Mike. Then click on OK. As we see here, the employee data have been retrieved in our form. Now let's change the query type, from searchable to a drop-down list, to represent the data in drop-down list format. Go back to the SQL Connector settings and change the query type to a drop-down list. As we see here, when selecting the drop-down list query type, there are some features are enabled, like Show Default Caption. You can select it if you want to add default text at the top of the values of the drop-down list. The other feature is to select whether to execute this query, on load, or on change. If you select the execute to be on load, the system automatically creates a new rule for executing the SQL query for the control. Let's preview the form and see how it works. As you see here, all the employee IDs that we have in the database are represented in the drop-down list. Now we want to retrieve the rest of the data for the selected employee, using the GetSQLData function, and set the values to the form controls. Back to the design mode. Select the SQL Connector control. Create a new rule. Modify the rule name. Select rule type action. And apply the rule on change. Add your condition if the employee number is selected. In the action text box, first we are going to use the setValue function. As we see here, this function needs two parameters: the control ID, which is the represent control, and the values that we are going to retrieve from the SQL database, by using the GetSQLData function. Let's add the function and set the parameters. Select the control ID, employee name, and the value that we are going to retrieve from the SQL query, by using the GetSQLData function. So again, from the right panel, function, search for GetSQLData. As we see here, this function needs two parameters: the control ID, which represents the SQL Connector ID, and the database field that wants to retrieve its value. If this parameter is empty, then it will return an array of all values of the selected record in the control. Select the control ID, employee number, and type the database field employee name. We are going to repeat these steps for all the data that we want. Then click Save. Okay, let's preview how it works. Let's select the employee number. And here are the employee data retrieved in our form. You can use the list of checkboxes, or the radio button instead of the drop-down list. Another advanced feature of the SQL Connector control is that you can create a dynamic SQL query and use filters by combining the query with dynamic objects such as form controls, form variables, and even with static values on the spot. In order to combine the selected data from that query with form controls and list columns, we will see together how to filter the SQL query with static values, or with the dynamic values of other control in the form, and how you can filter by composite values. First, I will filter the employees based on the specific department as a static value. Type HR department in the Where section to compare it with the department field in the database. Click on OK. Let's preview our form. As we see here, we have only the employee that belongs to the HR department. But what if I want to allow the user to select which department to filter based on? We can create the department forms control and use the selected value in the where statement. Drag and drop the department drop-down control. Back to the SQL Connector settings. Type department and compare with the department control value. Click on OK. Preview the form. Select HR department. Then click on the search icon. As we see here, the HR employees' data are displayed. Let's select another department. Again, here are the other department employees. As I mentioned before, you can combine your query with various values that you want, and you can combine more than one value, as we will see now. I am going to filter the SQL query with two values, the selected department value and the employee name value. Back to the SQL Connector settings. In the Where section, type department to compare with the department control value. And type the logical operator AND. You can type the AND operator, or the OR operator to add more filters to the SQL. After the AND, I am going to filter the employee names that match Alex, for example. OK. Let's preview our form now. Select IT department. Then click on the search icon. As we see here, employees' data is displayed from the IT department, and the employee name like Alex. We just watched how it's easy to add and configure the SQL Connector control for SharePoint forms using Spark Forms to integrate your form with external databases, without using SharePoint external connectivity services. How to return values based on the selected field's name specified in the database dialog setting. How you can use rules to consume all the selected field values returned from the search dialog. Also, how to generate your SQL query on form load or by any control in your form. And how to create dynamic queries by sending filters from the form controls. Follow us to learn more about advances used for SharePoint and Spark Forms. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and if you have a comment, please write it down. Thank you.